Welcome to our webinar today, the strategic comparative of AEV plus MITRE, which might be a surprise title for some of you since I just changed it. We still have a number of people coming in, and we will kick this off in just about 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to our webinar today, the strategic comparative of AEV plus MITRE, a threat-informed CTEM playbook. I'm joined today by a longtime good friend and associate, John Baker from the Center of Threat-Informed Defense. Welcome, John.
Hey, Carl. Thank you. Excited to be here today, and welcome everybody.
Well, team, I think we have a really special treat for you today. I think, from a market perspective, we've been hearing that cyber threat or continuous threat exposure management has really accelerated. A lot of CISOs and organizations, both on the government side as well as on the commercial side, have been reading about this and now I think thinking about this. Several Fortune 500 CISOs that I've talked to in the last few weeks tell me that from their perspective, CTEM is moving much faster than even Zero Trust did from a hype perspective, and many of them are looking at how to operationalize this this fiscal year and next fiscal year. So I think this is going to be a great topic for us today, John. And what I'm really excited about is that John and I have decided and started to write a book on this, but we're taking a slightly different approach, and we're gonna bring that out today. We think that CTEM is a great framework, and we're going to certainly talk about that today. But we also think that CTEM could use a little bit more threat-informed defense from a framework perspective for people that are thinking about how to operationalize it and take advantage of the framework and what it potentially means for the future of cybersecurity and organizations. And so with that said, and let me see if I can get the slide to advance forward here. What we're going to start off first is John's going to take us through something that you may or may not have heard of before. What we're going to talk about is the Center for Threat-Informed Defense and Threat-Informed Defense. And then we're going to talk about a project that we did last year called MITRE, which we think is going to be an integral part for how organizations operationalize the CTEM framework. So John, why don't you take us through this first?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. And again, super excited to be here. And I think there's a huge opportunity when you start to bring threat-informed defense together with CTEM. So I think I'll start with just a little bit of context about what the Center for Threat-Informed Defense is. We're a nonprofit research organization that brings sophisticated teams together to identify problems in the ecosystem, solve them in a way that benefits the whole community. We coined the term threat-informed defense as a way to describe our focus and eventually, what our mission would be. So our mission is to advance the state of the art and the state of the practice in threat-informed defense globally. So threat-informed defense, it's really about using knowledge of specific adversary behaviors, working to understand those behaviors, and then use that knowledge to drive improvements to our defenses. And so as a research program, what that means is we are continually, systematically working to advance community-wide knowledge of the specific things that adversaries actually do. And then we use that knowledge to drive improvement in defensive capabilities, to advance our ability to test and evaluate our systems based on those threats. I'm going to go to the next slide. When we think about threat-informed defense, expanding upon that definition, it's really important to understand it's a continuous process. It's a cycle. We're continually working to understand what exactly adversaries are doing, what specific behaviors are they implementing to achieve their goals, and then leveraging that knowledge to drive how we test and evaluate our systems. We want to look at our systems from the perspective of an adversary. We want to use that knowledge of how adversaries conduct attacks, how they achieve their goals, to evaluate our defenses, and then we want to use that knowledge to drive improvement to our defenses. For us, for threat-informed defense, MITRE ATT&CK really is at the core of threat-informed defense. MITRE ATT&CK gives us that common knowledge base of observed adversary behaviors. So the whole focus is taking us towards practical, real-world observed behaviors as you see them in MITRE ATT&CK to drive what it is we test, how we improve our defenses. And the cycle comes in with this realization that when you start, you're never going to defend against all the attack techniques. That doesn't make sense. You need to provide focus and scoping based on your organization, based on the sector you're in, based on the region you're in, based on your critical assets, and pull that together with that knowledge of threat, of adversary behaviors, to then drive the testing and defensive measures. And we recognize that it has to be a continual process because our environments are always changing. The threat actors are always evolving and changing. So it's that dynamic landscape or environment that we work in that necessitates this continual process. So when you think about threat-informed defense, I think it's important to understand it's intelligence-driven, it's understanding behaviors, it's a continuous process using that knowledge to evaluate our systems and to drive change. To make
John,
all that, go ahead.
I'm sorry, John, to interrupt, but we're definitely going to get into CTEM in a bit, quite a bit actually. But a lot of the words that you're using today to describe threat-informed defense seem to map directly into continuous threat exposure management. So,
yeah.
I think it's very interesting to me as we see the CTEM framework evolve. I think that a lot of people are going to start drawing a lot of parallelisms between the work the center's been doing for the last 5 years and the opportunity of CTEM that's before us today.
Yeah, I completely agree, Carl. If you jump into the next slide, I think maybe it makes sense to start talking a little bit about some of the research that we've done over the past year to help make threat-informed defense actionable. So we created a project called MITID, or Measure, Maximize, and Mature Threat-Informed Defense. If you go to the next slide, what we were trying to do is create a set of resources to help answer these basic questions that we get all the time. We get people asking, what it means to adopt and implement a threat-informed defense, what's good enough, where should they focus next, how do we know if we're actually getting better in our security program? And so it's these sort of questions that really drove what we developed in MITID, and that's what led us to creating something that looks a lot like a maturity model that looks across your organization at how effectively you're applying threat to your security program. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what we did was we took those three components or three dimensions of threat-informed defense, threat intelligence, your defensive measures, and your testing and evaluation, and we expanded upon them so that we could start to look at an organization and measure an organization against those three dimensions. As an example, I won't go quite through all of these, there's a website with all of this information on it and a set of tools to help you learn and apply MITID for your organization. When we talk about threat intelligence, there's the depth of that threat data. Are you looking specifically at indicators of compromise? Are you starting to understand the specific behaviors, the objectives that the adversary has? And then as you think beyond depth, there's the breadth of that data and the relevance of that data. Is it information that's relevant to your organization, or is it just general threat intelligence? As we go through each of these five components for each of the three dimensions, you can start to understand a sort of maturity for your organization. So I'm going to go and walk through a couple of those dimensions in a little bit more depth next here, Carl. So if we pick on threat intelligence and depth of threat data, what you might immediately start to see is that many organizations are not going to be at that highest level of maturity. number 5, where we're looking at low variance adversary behaviors. And you probably aren't going to be there for all threats, for all threat intelligence. You probably have a mix. That's okay, because it factors into this maturity model. And it might be that where you're at now is perfectly appropriate for your organization. And the next thing you need to do is start to build out, in this case, we've expanded the incident response capability. So looking at incident response, do you have playbooks in place that are either partially or fully automated? How effectively are you able to take detection and use that actually to be driven by threat actors, threat intelligence that you have? Or is it more ad hoc in nature and more reactive, right? And so for, again, each of these components, we've broken them down into these maturity levels. What that then looks like is there's a tool on our website, and then within the next couple of weeks, you'll see a web application that can guide you through your own assessment. So I'm going to walk through a scenario that I created for this webinar. You want to go to the next slide? So in this scenario, and I recognize this is an eye chart, we'll first give a high-level overview. So if you look across each of those components, you'll see you can kind of fill in and self-assess your organization. Go to the next slide. We'll pick on depth of threat data for a second. So in this organization, for this notional assessment I did, they're doing a really good job tracking IOCs, IPs, hashes, those sorts of things. That's great. That's essential, but it's also really important that they're starting to track and understand which specific tools and software are being used by the threat actors that are relevant to their organization. This is a nice progression beyond tracking IOCs and hashes because when those tools change, they get recompiled or a IP address changes, that means they're still understanding the specific tool and they're still perhaps able to detect that particular tool. The critical thing though is that transition point I just mentioned. Perhaps they're able to detect that tool. If we go to the next slide, we'll start to look at how they're utilizing that threat data. And so here, what you find is that this organization has done a nice job at starting to understand tools and specific behaviors. But if you kind of look through that list, they're not automatically ingesting it. It's not getting regularly reviewed by trained analysts. So you can start to see that work to create robust threat intel resources for their organization isn't backed up by application of that data. So this starts to identify a gap, a place where maybe the next thing to focus on is how do we action those reports, that intelligence that we have. If you go to the next slide. So if you expand that out and you've now gone and assessed across the 3 different dimensions and the 5 different components, you can start to look holistically at your cyber defenses and understand where you're particularly strong. And so you can see in the spider chart on the right, the outlier there where depth of threat data kind of surpasses everything else. Well, an ideal spider chart would look like a lot more balance across your defensive measures in your test and evaluation maturity. So METID then provides you with the guidance and resources to help you develop or advance your defensive measures or your test and evaluation maturity to be better aligned. So using METID, you can go through this continual process. You can track your change in your organization over time to see overall how effectively are you applying threat to your organization. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that's been a really interesting outcome from the METID research project is the team at PwC Japan saw what we had put together, and they wanted to understand at a national scale in Japan, what's the state of threat-informed defense? So they took METID and turned it onto an online survey and surveyed 200 different companies in Japan to come up with an approximation of the threat-informed defense maturity in Japan. They've continued to do further research and further surveying in a couple of papers since this. But this starts to show the power of having this lightweight maturity model to start to guide how you apply threat to your organization and then mature your organization systematically. The whole idea is that we ought to be leveraging threat to efficiently defend our organizations against the threats that matter most to us. I think that might be the end of the MITRE overview there, Carl.
No,
And
absolutely, John. Look, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but I'm incredibly excited about this project. Again, this is available on the Center for Threat Informed Defense website. We're actually kicking off the second MITRE project to expand even the scope of this great useful tool that you guys have already put together. That project is kicking off very soon. But I think, what's so interesting about MITRE in relationship to our topic today of CTEM is, and we'll talk about this in some great detail, is this really starts talking about how to measure the threat side of the house, right? And CTEM now is bringing in the risk side of the house as well. And so we're starting to see this convergence. We're going to talk a lot more about it, but of course, if you're going to do exposure management, it's all about measuring, right? At the end of the day. And I think for a lot of organizations that decide to take advantage of MITRE, just to kind of do a cursory analysis of their organization, they may find it very surprising where they're strong and where they're weak. It may be opposite of what they actually think what's going on. But unless you measure, you just never know, right?
what I've really liked, Carl, about MITRE as it has evolved, you can in an hour, 90 minutes, sit down and do an assessment of your organization and get practical, useful guidance from MITRE. Obviously, if you want to do a fully fledged assessment of your organization, you probably want to bring in some other stakeholders and turn it into a team event. But MITRE can be a really useful tool for getting people around a virtual table and talking through how effective are we across our organization. And one of the things that I think is a real theme with CTEM is that sort of breaking down of silos between the threat and risk management practices. That's really critical to a threat-informed defense. You need to be able to break down those silos and bring teams together to understand threat and to really mitigate it as an organization.
That's a perfect lead-in to our next section of the webinar today, where we're going to talk about continuous threat exposure management. We're going to talk about adversarial exposure validation, which is a very important capability and component to executing the CTEM framework. And then we're going to add in MITRE and see where this goes. John and I literally just came up with this idea last week. We've been talking about it for a while, and we think this is going to foster some really interesting and novel new thought in the area of threat-informed defense. Before I jump in, though, I do want to make sure the audience understands that CTEM, Gartner CTEM, is a framework. It is not a product per se, right? AEV is actually a product. AEV is a new Gartner category. Literally was on a call with the Gartner analyst who's writing the paper for adversarial exposure validation yesterday. And they're reporting in about 2 to 3 weeks, a new market study will be out on this category. And just for some folks that maybe this is new to on the webinar today, this is the combination of several categories of capabilities that have been in the marketplace for a while. Most notably is APTAS, Automated Pen Test as a Service, and breach and attack simulation are now combined into this AEV category with a number of very specific use cases, 3 in fact, where these capabilities are applied within the CTEM construct. We're going to cover a little bit of that today, but this is the first in a series of webinars, and we'll be diving deeper in this series of webinars into how to operationalize both CTEM and AEV leveraging MITRE. But let's, for the overview today, let's start to jump into it right now. So what I want to do first is just kind of set up the relationship between CTEM and AEV and how organizations to start thinking about operationalizing CTEM as a framework. We're going to dive deeper into CTEM, and we're going to just briefly cover AEV. We'll spend most of the time overlaying CTEM and MITRE today. What's important to understand from a CTEM perspective is there are very specific things that an organization is going to want to focus on, from scoping, discovery, prioritization, validation, mobilization. We'll talk more about that later. There's different capabilities that many organizations own and operationalize already today that fit into each of those different buckets of the framework. I think what's going to be important for organizations as we go forward is putting together playbooks based on their capability maturity model in order to operationalize this and get the best situational awareness and visibility. And also, as you start to think about which products and capabilities you already own and which ones that may be a gap for you in order to fill out the CTEM, that's going to be very strategic discussions for your organization. So I'll just cover this at a high level today, and again in future webinars we'll get much more detail. But an AEV solution does have the opportunity from a capability perspective to automate a lot of the CTEM framework, from discovery and prioritization and validation. A good AEV product is going to participate in all of those different bucketized functions from a service delivery workflow perspective. CTEM also provides a new approach to looking at exposure management and targeting those things that you care about most to make sure that the organization is allocating the right resources and cyber defensive operational capabilities to defend those resources. We can't defend everything in the organization at the same level, just like we can't look at the entire threat landscape and say we're going to defend the organization from every known TTP is out there, as John talked about before. And one of the things that we want to be able to do here is help organizations get started fast on their CTEM journey and simplify the adoption, with a tool set. And again, the benefits of that are ultimately reduce risk to the organization, improve the organization's security posture, and at the end of the day, save money. We'll spend a little bit of time talking later what this means organizationally, because the reality is that most organizations today operate with two sides of the house. They have the risk side of the house and they have the threat side of the house. And there's a need to what John said earlier, break down those silos to bring efficiency as well as, quite frankly, better decision support to the organization as they perform cyber defensive operations in support of whatever their mission is, whether it's make money or save lives, or in the case of Department of Defense, prosecute war. So let's jump into it a little bit, and we're going to obviously overlay a MITRE with John here on top of this. But at the end of the day, if you look at continuous threat exposure management, the word threat is in there, and that's important. And as we develop our playbooks for operationalization of CTEM, with the different capabilities that an organization has or will acquire, taking a threat-informed defense view of this is incredibly important. And I think I heard John say in his segment on MITRE and threat-informed defense continuous at least 5 times. And that's a huge part of this. And if we think about continuous, when we think about continuous, we should be thinking about automation. Think about where your SOC and cyber defensive operational capabilities are today, and think where they need to be in 5 years. The severity and the frequency of attacks and breaches is going up, regardless of the amount of dollars that people are spending. And the reality of the situation is we just can't do things, all the things that we've been doing that are advanced with bodies and people. We have to turn to automation where that makes sense. And so, John, why don't we talk a little bit about MITRE and how this fits perfectly into the CTEM here?
Yeah, absolutely, Carl. So as we kind of build this out, you'll see kind of recurring references back to some of my description of MITRE there. Yeah, with MITRE and threat-informed defense, we're creating this feedback loop. And in order to really do that, you end up actually optimizing your organization. I've started to see some teams even creating new job positions like Director of Threat-Informed Defense that starts to bring together vulnerability management, threat intelligence, SOC analysts, offensive security, so that they're all within one structure, just to try to eliminate those silos and facilitate that communication and collaboration among teams and set them up for this continuous environment where As you learn of new threats, as your environment changes, you're able to continually test, evaluate, and improve your defenses. A going in assumption with threat-informed defense is that, if you test a specific behavior in your environment and you make a change, you're going to learn. And that's going to probably provide input into your intel practice, which then continues that cycle, providing new information to how you test and evaluate. We want to understand that that's the environment we're in, that we want to kind of set ourselves up for that continual learning and the continual feedback based on changes in our environment, changes in the threat landscape, and what we learned on our last iteration. Right?
John, I always bring up Boyd in this particular, continuous discussion. And for those in the audience that are not familiar with OODA, or Observe, Orientate, Decide, Act, it's a process loop and it's a continual loop. And the idea here is very simple. If you can spin your loop faster than the adversary, you'll win. And the ability to have decision support and situational awareness, and to in a very aggressive way go about this programmatically, is going to put the organization in a much better cyber resilience and readiness posture if it's continuous. Your ability to identify gaps before adversaries take advantage of them, as an example, is what organizations need to do. Now, as we go into siloed and ineffective security efforts, I think organizations over the last 5 years have known that these silos are bad. And what we've seen, develop, and in fact, AttackIQ has built a number of fusion centers and purple teams and things of this nature, is a nod to the concept that we have to put together a tiger team or a process action team to come together to start addressing, where some of these knowledge, skills, and abilities live within the organization. Red teams are red teams, blue teams are blue teams, but the vulnerability management team, where are they? They're not even hanging out with either of these teams in most organizations today. And so as organizations realize that, to the extent from a capability maturity model perspective, that they could operationalize a purple team or could operationalize a fusion center, that was the first step into moving into continuous threat exposure management. And that to break down these silos, start sharing information, start sharing knowledge, skills, and abilities from a cross-functional team perspective. But what I think this means for the future, and most organizations need to take a very hard look at how cybersecurity and risk is structured in their organizations, is that you're going to see the vulnerability management team go work for the SOC. That you're going to see convergence of these teams together using a common set of tools, common set of lexicon, just like MITRE ATT&CK was a common lexicon back in the day for threat-informed defense. We have to now create a common lexicon and process in order to operationalize effectively the CTEM framework. John, you've got something on this too.
Yeah, I was going to say, Carl, as I kind of talked about it a little bit, the restructuring we're starting to see in organizations. The thing I would add at this moment is, by focusing on specific adversary behaviors that are relevant to your organization, it kind of gives you a purpose or sort of a common thread to follow through your organization. So as you work to break down those silos, you can use a specific behavior to work across teams to understand, if this behavior is executed in our environment, will we see it? Do we have a mitigation in place? And you can use that to start to talk to the IT team to understand what sort of logging or sensing or log storage they have in place, who has access to it. Maybe we see it, but the right people don't have access to that data. And so that focus on a specific behavior kind of allows you to pull the thread through your organization to figure out, can we see it? Can we act upon it when it occurs in our environment? What's a mitigation that we can implement in our environment to stop the damage or prevent this from occurring in our environment? And then actually actively test it in our environment to then prove out the mitigation was effective. We actually can see it. We actually are able to respond when we see it. But that focus on an individual behavior allows you to have something that kind of keeps everybody focused, keeps everybody coming to the table. We're here because we need to understand what happens if this occurs in our environment.
So the next one is inability to prioritize threats based on risk. And I have to be honest with you, John. Other than CVE and some of the work that we've done in the center, I've not really been operationally that exposed to vuln management programs in the past. Other than all my CISO friends seem to complain quite a bit about vuln management and how much energy and time they spend on it compared to the value that they derive coming out of the program. But I think, as you know, AttackIQ recently bought a vuln prioritization attack path management company called Deep Surface. And in talking to all those new customers that came over as a function of the acquisition, who are mostly vuln management administrators of all the great products that are out there today, the number one complaint that they had that they felt, the Deep Surface product helped them with was they couldn't adequately explain to infrastructure people why they need to go patch something right now, right? Yeah. And there was just always this breakdown operationally between their ability to describe the risk to the organization and why everybody needs to drop something right now and go patch that critical asset, right? And so I think one of the things I'm very excited about from a CTEM perspective is by bringing in kind of a much more threat-informed defense view of risk as it pertains to vuln management practices and CVSS or KEV and things like that. That changes that conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is a fundamentally different conversation. The classic challenge in vulnerability management is just the sheer volume of vulnerabilities and the need for context to understand the business impact, to understand from the threat perspective, are adversaries using this vulnerability? If they use this vulnerability, what can they achieve based on exploiting that vulnerability? With threat-informed defense, we're trying to provide resources to help vulnerability management teams look at that vulnerability, again, from that perspective of the adversary to say, yeah, that particular vulnerability is really important to us. It's being actively exploited. However, in our organization, we've been able to implement, these particular mitigating controls further downstream, and we have a robust defense in depth plan in place. So we can start to become more efficient and effective in how we do vulnerability management, leveraging that knowledge of the threat.
And I think every organization realizes they have a slow response to threats and misconfigurations. And one of the things this assumes is that they know about them. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, that they know that they have misconfigurations and that specific adversaries, that's the type of thing they'd like to take advantage of, right? So I think there's a gap between, think about all that vuln management data, asset criticality, CVSS scores, KEV scores, and kind of what the SOC is actually thinking about on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, it's completely overwhelming if you really look at the sheer volume of all the vulnerabilities, all the threats. You really have to be able to prioritize, and it becomes, I think, really critical to have that continual feedback loop in place, recognizing that you're never going to be able to solve all the problems right now. Let's use knowledge of threat to prioritize and focus on the next most important problem today. Absolutely. And then iterate through that loop.
So, organizations, I think, over the last 5 years have really gotten better at automated validation. I mean, we're definitely, from an AttackIQ perspective and all of our competitors in the market, it's been growing steadily over the last 5 years, whether it's automated or not automated. Organizations are indeed spending more money on validating and getting situation awareness and visibility into the effectiveness of their controls. But again, that has been largely stovepiped, around the threat side of the house and not really taking in the risk side of the house. So, John, as we, you and I have been working on the threat side for so long, what opportunities do you see here for this convergence?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite research projects out of the center is very focused on helping us understand not just the individual technique, but the context around it and the path that an adversary actually uses. I'm thinking of the attack flow project, Carl, where we've built a data model representing sequences of adversary behaviors. Understanding individual techniques is critical. Understanding how an adversary puts those techniques together to achieve a goal in your environment is really important. It allows us to then start to more faithfully test and validate our defenses. And it also, kind of going back to that defense in depth concept, allows us to start to think about defense in depth strategies for mitigating overall threats.
Well, so let's walk the dog on that for a second and help the audience understand kind of how this all comes together now. We're certainly going to double click on that a little bit more later. But so I've got threat intel that says my organization is being targeted by Fin6. It's just an example. I also have some other threat intel that identifies from an indications and warning perspective that they may be targeting specific assets in my organization. Let's just call them 1.2.3.4, right? So now I've got actionable threat intelligence, right? Now, if I combine my vuln management capability into this discussion, I can see that 1.2.3.4 is some mission critical Linux server that has a KEV, right? And now I know it has a KEV. I see through my attack path management capability that there's 5 paths that an adversary could take to potentially take advantage of that KEV. But if I evaluate and test, I can see that 3 of those 5 paths are dead ends, meaning there's compensating controls that interdict the adversary that's going after that particular asset from either a prevention or detection perspective. But I also see that there's 2 paths that this particular adversary could take that don't have compensating controls. So what should I do today, John, in that particular case?
Yeah, so by understanding that path, it opens up the opportunity to think about, in this case, maybe the right thing to do is patch that vulnerability, but maybe you're in an environment where you just can't patch that vulnerability right now. And so then you can start to look about, sort of around that system and understand, based on this path, maybe there's some other compensating control that we can put in place. Maybe to implement that attack path, they have to be able to move laterally. But because you've implemented zero trust in your environment, you're going to have a really good mitigation in place for that lateral movement, which might help you mitigate that those last 2 remaining attack paths. By understanding the path that the adversary might use and has been seen to use in other environments, you can have that conversation, Carl, where if you're just focusing on, I got to react to the latest ransomware attack without understanding, what that attack really means, you really don't have that ability to take that defense in depth strategy or approach.
And in my mind, this is exactly the reason this use case we just went through, why threat-informed defense exists, but why it makes it exposure management better. And this is also the exact reason when you think about all the different systems that are underlying that discussion we had, that's cross-functional across lots of teams that are siloed today. And so in order to do this and have that conversation John and I just did, you have to break down those silos. You have to take a different view of cyber defensive operations. We're going to speed this up a little bit. We've only got a few slides left and definitely want to get to the playbook that we think everyone will find interesting. It's just an example of a playbook, but again, we do think organizations will need to think about CTEM from that perspective. I think everybody understands the difficulty aligning cybersecurity with business objectives. John and I have been doing MITRE ATT&CK and CTEM now together for 5 years, and I think John, for 5 years, I've been saying, there's a glass ceiling. There's a glass ceiling for MITRE ATT&CK. It doesn't translate well up into the boardroom, right? Whereas, quite frankly, the vuln management side and risk side of the house is translated nicely. So I think, this is a real opportunity for us, to come together and talk about, where compliance-driven approaches and threat-driven approaches converge.
Yeah, I think, this just reminds me of one of our very first research projects, Carl. We wanted to create a bridge between the teams that are responsible for the compliance initiatives in an organization and the threat and the security operations team, because they kind of thinking about breaking down silos. They've been siloed for years and years. We want to make it much easier for you to understand how those compliance-driven approaches directly align or don't with the threats that are important to your organization. So we've done a lot of work to map things like NIST 853 to MITRE ATT&CK, so you can create that direct connection and create that communication mechanism across teams. So you can start to understand and justify that investment in compliance.
You know, that was one of my favorite projects, so thank you for bringing that up. And for those interested in MITRE ATT&CK mappings, there's a ton of them that we've done, whether it's MITRE ATT&CK mappings to Azure or Google or GCP or NIST 853 or CVE, or KEV. There's a lot of these mappings that can help organizations better translate, the value of a threat-informed defense to different teams and things like that. Okay, so last thing that we just want to double click on is what we think CTEM solves. I think at the end of the day, situational awareness and visibility is paramount to an organization's ability to make decisions and having decision support. So we definitely think continuous visibility and prioritization, leveraging your attack simulation capabilities, and some level of automated remediation is where organizations need. That's where the puck, got to skate to where the puck is going, and that's where it's at. There's already a bunch of capabilities you probably own and operate in silos today, and what CTEM is really talking about is bringing that together into a single operational framework. Anything last on this particular slide, John?
I think the only thing I would add is that, very complementary to CTEM. When you start to think about threat-informed defense, it fundamentally, as I started out with, is about understanding adversary behaviors, understanding the set that are relevant to your organization, and then using that to prioritize where you focus next and how you bring those teams and those resources together.
Thanks. All right, team, we have 2 more slides, and then thank you for being with us this long. We will make this available to you. This is just one concept behind the threat-informed CTEM playbook. John and I will be doing quite a bit of writing on this in the future and thinking about this as well to help organizations better operationalize CTEM and some of the capabilities that make it up. So I think I really have 3 takeaways on this. I'm not going to read this slide to you. You guys can have it. But the reality is a lot of organizations already own different technologies and capabilities within their enterprise today to kind of supplement or fill out the CTEM framework. It's really about how you task organize to use the data and the type of decision support you put in place to take advantage of this. And I'll always bring you back to the OODA, Observer Oriented Decide Act, and getting all that data aggregated and put into a place so that the teams can make good decisions together in order to positively affect the cyber resilience and readiness of the organization. But John, I think, why don't we take just a couple minutes and double click on the MITRE component of the playbook?
Yeah, I think you're going to keep hearing this sense that CTEM and MITRE, they're very complementary from my perspective. As you kind of break down this playbook that Carl's presented here, you can start to see how MITRE guides you in applying threat intelligence to your organization, helps you think about vulnerabilities from the perspective of the adversary to drive prioritization of your vulnerability management practice and better understand the real risk to your organization, and opens up, as we talked about, opportunities for defense in depth approaches. It's all about that continual feedback loop and that realization that you don't have to start with all the techniques, all the threats at once. Pick one, follow it through your organization. Can I see it? Do we have a prevention or mitigation in place? Now let's validate that and continue that cycle, right? And I think both CTEM and MITRE have this theme of, this is a framework and there's a way to kind of guide you through it to mature your organization, mature your security program, and try to do it efficiently and effectively based on threat.
So our last slide, John, and I said this 5 years ago. I said this, when we first met. I've been saying it every day since. To me, it boggles my mind that we have these disparate teams that haven't been working together to take a holistic approach to the cyber defensive operations of the business or the government entity or whatever that might mean. I think, one of the big organizational changes that CTEM represents is this convergence of risk management and threat management into teams that are working together, right? Specifically, vuln management, moving over, working for the SOC, and be part of a broader exposure management kind of concept. The purpose of this pyramid today, and it obviously looks a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's on purpose, is that, and I know there's a lot more steps in a risk management program and a threat management program, but at the base layer, I think you'll find this interesting. Obviously, in risk management, we focus on identifying and asset discovery. On the threat management side, we focus on threat intel and situational awareness for what that means to your organization. On the risk management side, we focus on risk prioritization and assessment from mostly a vuln asset perspective without any kind of visibility into compensating controls, other things in your environment. They may influence that risk prioritization and assessment. Meaning, if I have compensating controls, the same conversation we had, John and I had just a second ago, that protect an asset, then is it really my top thing I need to go fix today? And again, a lot of those decisions are made in a silo today. Threat detection and response is hugely responsible. And again, that everything we do from that perspective, needs to be rationalized with the assets and the assessments of the assets and the risks of those assets and the prioritization of those assets. But largely today, that team doesn't talk to the other team either. And then, of course, incident response, containment, remediation, and mitigation. But what all these share in every framework that you look at separately is at the top of risk management and the top of threat management. And John obviously we just spent some great time talking about MITRE, was validation and improvement, right? And so in many ways, there's a lot of overlap in between these two different, in many cases, disparate teams that are focused on these areas. And so there's opportunities for real synergy. And I think one of the fun things here is that MITRE's on both sides of the house. 25 years ago, MITRE, invented the CVE framework. A few years ago, MITRE invented the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And John, I'm totally going to bring up our latest project that we just completed together, which is the prioritized known exploited vulnerabilities, which is exactly the convergence of what we're talking about. Do you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, I think it's a great project. It's obviously timely for this webinar. What we're trying to do is leverage the vulnerabilities in CISA's KEV list, the known exploited vulnerability list, and provide context around those vulnerabilities to help you understand the impact of those vulnerabilities for an adversary. So specifically, an exploited vulnerability, how does an adversary exploit that vulnerability? And then what can they do next once they've exploited that vulnerability? This then allows you to take that defensive depth approach to mitigating vulnerabilities or to vulnerability management. This, like all of our other work, is up, it's open and freely available. I encourage you to go take a look at it on our website. If you do a Google search for PKEV or even just CTID, you'll see all of our work on our website, open, freely available for you. It's a practical resource that your vulnerability management and threat management teams can use today to start to have a shared point of communication and collaboration.
Well, John, I want the audience to go one step further. I love them to grab that project and without any automation and all the great things we talked about, go do a tabletop exercise. Grab one of the KEVs and the mappings of it, bring your vuln management team in, bring your threat management team in, and do a tabletop exercise of how the organization would deal with one of these mappings. And I think what you'll find is that, oh crap, we do have a lot of silos. They don't speak the same language, right? We need to maybe up-level some skill sets here in order to facilitate this with somebody who can manage these two teams together, right? So I strongly encourage you to take a look at that particular project and just run one tabletop exercise to see how close you are in order to do it. And you can even bring MITRE into that, right?
Yeah.
And use one of these KV mappings with MITRE to kind of underscore your scoring that you have for that. Last note I want to make is obviously at the end of the day, we all want to be self-actualized, and for cybersecurity, we want to be the most secure we can be. In order to do that, I'm arguing We have to have convergence. Organizations need to adopt CTEM based on their capability maturity models. And the last thing I want to note is without AEV and validating compensating controls, the story doesn't work. It absolutely doesn't work, because if I have a asset that's highly critical with a KEV, but I have compensating controls, maybe that is not the organization's priority today. Maybe they need to go focus on assets that are critical with KEVs that don't have compensating controls. And you'll not know that unless you evaluate. It's impossible. So you have to get out there and do that. John, huge thank you for today and our audience that stayed on. I know we went over time, but this is the first in a series of 3 webinars. We'll be getting in much more technical detail in the follow-ons. But John, big thank you for you and the center for being here today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carl. I really enjoyed the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Thank you, audience. This recording will be available shortly after the webinar concludes, in case you missed a piece or came in late, or you'd like to share it with one of your associates or friends. Thank you very much, and have a great weekend, everyone.